So, this movie hits different in 2021. I admit I have not watched it in quite some time, and I had figured that it would just be fun, what with the 5th of November happening on a Friday this year, perfectly in line with my schedule. But uh, I gotta say, I had forgotten a lot of the plot, and after like a decade of not watching it, I didn't remember the virus, and I didn't remember like the government overreach, and it's all just so incredibly relevant to the current state of both American politics and what I understand English politics. So it is somehow aged both better and worse than I could have possibly imagined. Content warning. This review will contain explicit references to fascism, government abuse, terrorism, death by a deadly virus, government sponsorship of said virus, murder, torture, pedophilia, homophobia, abuse, politics, both my politics as a leftist, and a reaction to conservative politics of both reality and the movie, and me looting over Natalie Portman because, well, I have to have something that's a little less depressing for me. Viewer discretion is advised. This video will contain spoilers for the year 2020, 2021, and V for Vendetta. If you do not wish to have spoilers for the aforementioned, please teach me how you avoided learning about them. Pretty please. Please save me from this terrible fucking reality that I live in. The movie opens with a voiceover from Evie, played by Natalie Portman, recounting the events of Guy Fawkes, a terrorist who tried to overthrow the British government in 1605. The voiceover laments that we don't know much about the actual man, but we do know about his plot.
I know his name was Guy Fawkes, and I know in 1605 he attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament. But who was he really?
And that he was hung. Right out of the gate, we are foreshadowing, and we will only continue to foreshadow more and more from here. Evie and V, played by Hugo Weaving, are getting ready separately. You know, they're doing their hair, they're doing their makeup, they're donning a really neat-looking iconic mask that is later co-opted by weird reactionaries on the internet. The television is being played over this. A right-wing demagogue, Louis Prothero, played by Roger Elam, is spewing hateful rhetoric about gays, Muslims, and anyone else who isn't a traditional face of the very Anglo-Saxon London.
We did what we had to do. Islington, Enfield, I was there, I saw it all. Immigrants, Muslims, homosexuals, terrorists, disease-ridden degenerates. They had to go. Strength through unity. Unity through faith. I'm a God-fearing Englishman, and I'm goddamn proud of it.
Evie heads out and is stopped by a couple of delightful young chaps looking to go out and have a drink at the bar, and they kindly ask her to accompany them, since these streets are so dangerous, and, you know, given that there are rapists about. In fact, they actually prove this point to be quite true.
Maybe you could look after us before getting back to your uncle. See, my friend here, he's kind of sick, don't you, Willie?
Real sick. Bad case of the blues. You can feel them.
Or, at least, they would have, had V not intervened. He hands them their arses with ease, then gives one of the most fun speeches that I've ever heard in any film.
Voila! In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of the vox populi, now vacant, vanished. However, this valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified, and has vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition. The only verdict is vengeance, a vendetta, held as a votive not in vain, for the value and veracity of such shall one day vindicate the vigilant and the virtuous. Verily, this vichyssoise of verbiage veers most verbose, so let me simply add that it's my very good honor to meet you, and you may call me V.
She introduces herself and he becomes enamored immediately, especially because he interprets their meeting as Providence. V is the Roman numeral for the number 5, and E is the 5th level of the alphabet. So she is basically V squared. Not to be confused with Vsauce squared.
Hey, Vsauce! Michael here.
So he decides to take her on a date. She's really unsure of this because he's kind of a weird guy, but, ultimately agrees despite her reticence. But he shows her a good time. Anyone would be excited because he takes her up to a rooftop and, just gives her quite the show.
Just follow these steps. 1. Cut a hole in a box. 2. Put your junk in that box. 3. Make her open the box.
Hey, Vsauce! Michael here.
By blowing up a fucking building in front of her. I don't know about you, but that would make my panties wet. She gets quite weak in the knees for this, and as he promised before whisking her away, she does in fact get home safe. The next day, Evie goes into work, and we get several cut-ins from other characters working to spin the story of the bombing of the Old Bailey. The government's official line was that they were planning on demolishing the building already, and the fireworks were just some playful scamps of demolition men, a career well known for its pranksters. The television station that Evie works for was delivered some unknown packages that no one knows what to deal with, and V goes about breaking into the TV station. The police are already on to Evie due to her being caught on some security cameras, which is pretty convenient, but I guess Big Brother is everywhere. Did you know that London actually has the most cameras per capita of anywhere in the world? Like, including China? That's fucking crazy. V has the TV producers play a GameCube game where he announces that the government is full of shit, that he blew up the Old Bailey, that it was not a part of anyone's plans. In a bonus level, he announces that he's going to blow up Parliament on the anniversary of today, November the 5th. And I want to make a brief aside about this. This movie makes Guy Fawkes and his compatriots out to be heroes, people standing up for what they believe in, which isn't entirely fair. It could be considered a lie used to tell the truth as the movie goes on and on about.
Artists use lies to tell the truth.
But Guy Fawkes was trying to blow up the House of Lords, which is a really important part of the English government, in an attempt to kill King James I and install a Catholic monarch to the throne. He was trying to create a theocracy, and theocracies are bad. And in fact, this movie makes that very point. The lack of religious freedom is one of several signifiers that the movie gives us that the government employees are in fact the baddies.
No, you haven't been listening to Allied propaganda. Of course they're going to say we're the bad guys.
So, while I accept that the mimetic drift of Guy Fawkes' legacy is no longer directly tied to creating a theocracy, I feel the need to point it out nonetheless, because some people will use this movie and the comic in order to justify their agendas, regardless of whether or not any of the creators involved agree. Death of the author goes both ways. J.K. Rowling ain't the only one that we ignore because her politics are shit. And once again, trans rights are human rights. Anyone who disagrees can fuck right off. It turns out that the delivery that Evie had received were a bunch of Guy Fawkes masks that V forces everyone to wear, causing a lot of confusion when the police come in and start, shooting people because they're the police. V is about to actually succeed in escaping, but he is stopped by a cop who is about to try and bring him in. Evie, however, intercedes and helps him by pepper spraying the cop, which is really cool. Good for her. ACAB. But she's knocked the fuck out afterwards. We cut to a detective that has been following the lead characters and trying to unravel the connection between Evie and V. Chief Inspector Finch, played by Stephen Rea, has been directed by Sutler, played by John Hurt, the leader of the country, to catch our terrorist friends. Evie wakes up to V being downright domestic. He lives in this underground area with tons of reclaimed art, and at first, Evie is pissed at V and herself now that she's kind of ruined her life and cannot return to it at all. But he makes her breakfast, and that makes everything okay, especially because the breakfast has real butter.
That's delicious.
Good.
God, I haven't had real butter since I was a little girl.
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes.
V uses the key card that he stole from Evie to get into Prothero's house, and more specifically in the shower, which is really weird. Why would she have access there? She seemed to be a secretary to a producer, and this guy is considered to be massively important. He is the voice of London.
Listen to me, you bleeding sod. England prevails because I say it does, and so does every lazy cunt on this show, and that includes you.
And one of the richest men in the country, or was, before V murdered him. Oh well, c'est la vie. Or c'est la muerte? The government decides to spin this as heart failure instead, but pretty much everyone from the news reporters to the people down on the street realize this is bullshit. V, being a cultured man, knows the way to a British woman's heart. He's watched Me Before You, and he knows that having her watch a movie with him will melt all of her resistance to his charms. She remarks that she really liked the movie, but she feels really sorry for the Count of Monte Cristo because even though they end up together, he still chose revenge before her, which definitely isn't going to come up later in the movie. She then catches a news story about Prothero's death and susses out that it was a boy who done it, but someone didn't put any emergency buttons on for this particular Among Us game, so she can't even report him. Evie reveals her tragic backstory, TMCR. Her parents were apparently these really cool artists, but they were drawn into the protests after the government cracks down on everything and their son dies in the St. Mary's terrorist attack. St. Mary's was a biological attack onto a bunch of people that killed 80,000 people before the government released a vaccine for it. I'd like to put some perspective on this. COVID, at the time of writing, has killed 120,000 people in England alone so far. So our reality is actually worse, at least in this respect, than the dystopian near future of Alan Moore. Anyway, she watched her mother get beat and bagged and taken away, and since then, she's been terrified and can't stand up to the government, which is understandable. He then asks for her help. He wants to get close to someone, a priest with a penchant for little girls.
She has arrived, but there was some confusion at the agency, and they've sent a new girl who I'm afraid is a little older than usual.
Older? Oh dear, she's not too old, I trust.
That is for your grace to decide.
Portman was 25 at the time of filming, but, I mean, it is Natalie Portman, so no straight man could possibly resist her. She gets the priest alone, dressed garishly in something to make her look younger, but honestly, it just kind of looks like a gothic Lolita. She spills the beans immediately, but the priest is super into roleplay.
I don't have much time and I have to tell you something.
A confession. I love the confessional game.
and he tries to R-word her, because literally everyone in this movie is a bad person. V bursts in and does a murder, and Evie fucking books it. Rightfully so. She goes to Gordon Dietrich's place, who is played by Stephen Fry. Apparently the reason that he agreed to do this was because he would get murdered on screen, because apparently he had never done that before, which is just really cool, actually. I guess spoilers for like a minute into the movie review. But I was going to get to it anyway. He welcomes her into his home, and she laments bringing all of this trouble onto him, noting that if anyone found out, he'd be in a lot of trouble. Gordon, being an eccentric weirdo, takes her to his basement where he reveals all kinds of kinky stuff, like the Quran and references to punk music, and he reveals that he's gay, which is a capital offense in this fucking hellscape.
If I were to invite who I desired, I would undoubtedly find myself without a home, let alone a television show.
Finch is still digging and discovers that Prothero was hella rich even before becoming the most recognizable face in the country. He was also stationed at some facility after a really successful military career, which seems weird and out of place to the inspectors. He tries to do some more digging into what that facility did, but everyone is pretty tight-lipped about it. Finch discovers that the botanist that he had looking into the rare rose that V leaves at every crime scene also worked for the same facility that the other people, including the bishop and Prothero, and figures out that she's the next target. He doesn't realize this in time to save her. V breaks into her house while she's asleep, and she wakes up. She knows that she's about to be murdered, and she seems almost grateful to V, lamenting that she failed to kill herself after all of the terrible things that she had done, and how callous she had been at that time. She also recounts the terrible fury of one patient of hers that survived the fire that ended this facility.
I was trying to understand how it could have happened when I saw him, the man from room 5. He looked at me. Not with eyes. There were no eyes. But I know he was looking at me because I felt it.
This man with no eyes that still managed to stare furiously into her soul. The man that was killing her so gently. V had injected her with the poison in her sleep, which is a big contrast to the more violent deaths that he's given Prothero and the other characters that he's murdered in the movie. Dietrich decides to buck against the insanity that is this government, and he plays a skit that makes fun of Sutler and the government as a whole. His house is raided, and we see him beat in much the same way that we had seen Evie's mother. Evie tries to escape, but she's caught and questioned by a shadowy figure, and we shave off her beautiful hair. But it's still Natalie Portman, so even bald, I'm deeply in love with her. The shadowy voice is determined to find V, but she doesn't give him up. She is tortured, and they dump her face into a pool of water and barely feed or clothe her, which is similar to the stories that were going on of the torture that was happening in Abu Ghraib under the Bush administration. Her only comfort is a story of a lesbian, Valerie, played by Natasha Whiteman, who is slipping a piece of toilet paper through the crack in the wall. It details the slow shift in society. No one approved of her sexuality, some people insisting that it was just a phase, her family disowning her, but she did find love. She was happy for some time, until the authoritarian government really started to take over in 2015. Fuck. This movie is so uncomfortable right now. So I'm going to distract myself with some petty, pedantic bullshit. This letter seems pretty far-fetched. Like, how did she get a pencil when these people don't even give them clothes? And I know that she's hiding it in the toilet, but what if the tip broke? What was she going to do then? It's not a major plot hole, but it did occur to me. They continue to question Evie, and when they determine that she's not going to crack and give up our boy, One guard comes in, preparing her for her execution, and he gives her one last chance to spill the beans, but she refuses.
Thank you, but I'd rather die behind the chemical sheds.
Then you have no fear anymore. You're completely free.
He then walks away and leaves the door open, allowing her to escape. She looks around and discovers that this has all been a ruse by V, and she is livid. But he points out that this was a valuable lesson, as though that would be any comfort, because he's a gaslighting fuck. And she does accept it. She asks V to bring her outside, and he does. She walks out into the rain and cries out, raising her arms in either celebration or lamentation. And this motion mirrors V's delightfully. He was reborn in anger and flame. She was reborn in water and skips past the rage straight to acceptance. She says that she's going to leave and tries to give back Valerie the lesbian's letter, assuming that he had written it. He reveals that the letter actually is genuine and was passed on to him when he was being experimented on at the facility. And V asks to see her one last time before November 5th, and she agrees. Finch is still trying to piece together the conspiracy when he gets an email from one of the men that is listed as someone who worked at the facility and has long since disappeared. They meet, and this man spills the beans.
Our story begins, as these stories often do, with a young, up-and-coming politician. He's a deeply religious man and a member of the Conservative Party. He's completely single-minded and has no regard for the political process. The more power he attains, the more obvious his zealotry, and the more aggressive his supporters become.
He says that the St. Mary's virus was orchestrated by the government, and the cure was discovered at the facility that V was reborn in. V was the only survivor of these terrible experiments.
Imagine a virus, the most terrifying virus you can, and then imagine that you and you alone have the cure. But if your ultimate goal is power, how best to use such a weapon?
Creedy, played by Tim Pigot-Smith, I think I'm pronouncing that right, had the idea to stage an attack against the people to help Sutler rise and seize more power.
He is a man seemingly without a conscience, for whom the ends always justify the means, and it is he who suggests that their target should not be an enemy of the country, but rather the country itself. 3 targets are chosen to maximize the effect of the attack: a school, a tube station, and a water treatment plant.
Finch offers to take the man into protective custody, but he declines, saying that he'd only agree if they kept Creedy under surveillance to make sure that he doesn't get murdered. They do so, but they never hear from this man again. V uses this opportunity to blackmail Creedy, pointing out that he's being watched and followed, and that Sutler would betray him if it means that he would get to keep his power. If Creedy turns in Sutler, V will give himself up. Creedy reluctantly agrees. The inspector gets a call revealing that the man that he had spoken to had been dead for 20 years, and he figures out that it must have been V in a disguise. With the 5th quickly approaching, the government starts to look into preventative measures to make sure Parliament doesn't do the explodes. Finch thinks that the attack is going to come from underground railroads that have been closed for quite some time, but everyone else thinks that it's going to come from above because they're idiots. V sends out Guy Fawkes merch to all of his top Patreon contributors, and people really resonated with it. It must be great for his analytics, and I know something about great analytics. Riots spark up due to the discontent that everyone is feeling. Sutler tries to crack down on the people, but this only worsens the situation, which also sounds incredibly familiar. Evie does meet with V one last time, and they dance.
2 trailer park girls go round the outside, round the outside, round the outside. 2 trailer park girls go round the outside, round the outside, round the outside.
He takes her to a train which is loaded with explosives and gifts it to her, which is some really high-level equipment to, like, a second-level rogue. come on now. You can't just give that stuff to your players that early. Wait at least until level 5 before they have the ability to blow up a building. He says that it's not his place to decide whether or not to blow up Parliament. She protests, realizing this is way out of level, and that in order to earn it, she would have to do some serious grinding. Natalie Portman grinding. No. I have to concentrate. I cannot think about Natalie Portman grinding right now. There's a review to do, no matter how happy that thought makes me. She insists that he needs to decide, but he thinks that someone with a theoretically clearer head needs to make this decision. He walks away and thus closes the loop of foreshadowing that the man was going to choose revenge over the woman. Creedy meets with V and brings out Sutler. He shoots the country's leader in the head, and V starts to leave, but Creedy is like, nah dog, you're surrounded. And V looks him dead in the eye and says, yes, I'm surrounded by dead men and fear. And then proceeds to bullet time until everyone is dead. He takes some shots, but he has an idea, which is like a headache with pictures, and those are immune to bullets. Trust me, I know my headache is always immune to bullets, at least for a time. He manages to stumble back to our girl, stopping for a moment to graffiti the wall with his signature. She holds him as he dies, but he does manage to confess his love for her. See, introverts? The worst thing that happens if you confess your love for someone is you die, which sounds like a win-win to me. Finch catches up with Evie as she is about to pull the lever and is like, don't. And she's like, don't what? And he says, pull the lever. And she's like, pull the lever? Okay. And she does, sending off the train. This all happens as tens of thousands of Guy Fawkes descend upon Parliament. It's like a hacker convention, but probably with more deodorant. Parliament explodes, but like with the Old Bailey, this also has fireworks, making it really pretty to look at. Natalie and Finch watch from very far away. So this movie is pretty topical, right? For so many reasons. For one, we have a virus that has killed tens of thousands of people. We have a fascistic government that relies on media manipulation and violent police forces to suppress the public and generally cannot be trusted. One that committed very well-known conspiracies to maintain and grow their power. And, as a lefty, I have to love that, right? And I do. It does have Natalie Portman, and she could literally stab me, and I would love that too. She could do anything to me. But I'm also a bit nervous. This movie could be read pretty easily to support the wrong type of protester, like the sort on January 6th. Those guys seem to genuinely believe that the Biden administration is fascistic, and it would be pretty easy for these people to eschew all of the left-wing things in the film, like the advocacy for freedom of the press, or freedom of religion, the ability to love whoever you want, as long as it's not hurting anyone. And just being free to do things that you want and go places when you want. The government in this film is authoritarian right-wing.
He's a deeply religious man and a member of the Conservative Party. He's completely single-minded and has no regard for the political process. The more power he attains, the more obvious his zealotry, and the more aggressive his supporters become.
And while the Biden administration is probably about halfway there itself, far too right in order to make the changes that need to be made, like fighting climate change, giving people more upward mobility and health care. They're not anywhere near as fascistic as even the Trump administration or the Bush administration. They're definitively better than those, which is a low bar, but hey, what can you do? These people would undoubtedly cast themselves in V and idolize their attempted coup against the government. The one where they were willing to zip tie and murder Congress people that they disagree with. Congress people that they think are literally kidnapping children and drinking their blood and adrenochrome or whatever. And don't get me wrong, the Biden administration is kidnapping children, just as the Trump administration did. But it's not to drink their blood, it's because they were asylum seekers and our government are monsters, sometimes. So this movie is a mixed bag, like I said. It's very relevant to today, but it could easily be co-opted by right-wing reactionaries, despite being very left-leaning, just like The Matrix before it. It does have an excellent message. We should stand up to tyranny when we see it, and that does include the Biden administration. The children in cages that everyone was so concerned about during the Trump administration are still there, and we should still do something about that. It's not right what they're doing. They're sterilizing a bunch of those asylum seekers. They will not do anything to help them, and that's wrong. But also, Trump is worse. It's thanks to Trump and that bastard McConnell that we now also have to fight for reproductive rights. The right to choose, the right to bodily autonomy for people assigned female at birth. So yeah, I don't necessarily want to blow anything up, but I think we should definitely stand up to these people. It should also be noted that while the original comic was a response to Reagan-era and Thatcher-era politics, this movie is fundamentally a response to the Blair-Bush era and the War on Terror. The false flag plot is literally calling them out for using a terrorist attack to amass more power.
But if your ultimate goal is power, how best to use such a weapon?
And the movie does say that the government planned this themselves.
It is he who suggests that their target should not be an enemy of the country, but rather the country itself.
Which is not something that I believe they did in the case of 9/11. I just think that they took advantage of it. Both the real-world administrations and the fictional one use these attacks as an excuse to ostracize and other Muslims and refocus the attention and even conflate their religious fervor of the Christian God with being a good citizen.
Strength through unity. Unity through faith. I'm a God-fearing Englishman, and I'm goddamn proud of it.
It should be noted that a lot of the actions taken by the Bush administration and the Blair administration led directly to the political climate that gave rise to Trump and Boris Johnson, as well as the political climate where people felt distraught enough to attack the capital of the United States. Fascists like Sutler and like Trump prey on the weakness and divisiveness in a society in order to collect power. And yes, I am saying that Trump was a fascist. He was just really bad at being a fascist. He is a fairly charismatic person who preyed on the racial tensions and pushed forward a bullshit culture war in order to amass power. He also carefully cultivated which news that he and his followers would deem to be true and seeded distrust in anything that he had not okayed, labeling it all as fake news. Had he been less blitheringly incompetent, he would have been a lot more dangerous. We might have seen something more akin to Sutler. And I want to specify, it was not for lack of trying. He did use authoritarian methods in order to quell speech against him. He literally had the police seeked on protesters, much in the same way that Sutler had done. He and Sutler both took any joke about him as a personal slight against him and the state, and Trump did push these people to be taken off the air. So yeah, while I understand people's discontentment with the current situation, with the incredible disparity that people feel between the fact that the mega rich just have so much power and there's seemingly nothing that an individual can do about it, and climate change and just the fact that the world is in a pretty shitty state. Charismatic leaders, like Trump and like Sutler, use the fact that not a lot of people are taught how to navigate media and fact check very well, and manipulate them to amass their own power. And it's pretty easy to see that from a different perspective, V is just a terrorist who is completely off his rocker and not justified for his actions. The narrative pushed forward by the movie is a construct, and we have to parse real life in order to determine who is actually right and who is wrong. People like the insurrectionists who attempted to capture and murder the government in order to install an idiot fascistic leader are obviously in the wrong. But it's not always going to be as clear-cut as that. So while we can't necessarily trust the government to tell us the truth, we should also not trust everyone who tries to dismantle the government. We should distrust anyone who claims to have all of the answers, which, to the movie's credit, V doesn't do in the end. That's why he passes the decision off to someone who he admittedly spent a good portion of time in the movie radicalizing. V for Vendetta is a very vibrant and vicious movie, vilifying vermin and vosh-offing vices and victimizing veterans of the cultural shift. Okay. Admittedly, I'm not as well spoken as V or as clever, or as radical, as it turns out. And I might be wrong. Grave action may be required to act in accordance with the wishes of the people, but I'm still hesitant to do that. Maybe I'm a coward, but when it comes to such big issues, I would like to carefully consider major actions that we're taking and to see and make sure to limit collateral damage. With that said, given the state of the world and the fact that November 5th falls on a Friday, I could not pass up the chance to rewatch this movie. Especially not when it lines up so perfectly with my schedule and with everything that's happening in the world. I still find it really ironic that the movie and the comic idolize Guy Fawkes, the man who was trying to install a theocracy, while simultaneously vilifying the people who did effectively that. But I guess, like Batman, he makes a better symbol than he does a person. And I'll end the review with this. I like the movie, and I will follow its advice. I will, in fact, remember, the 5th of November. Gunpowder, treason, and plot. I know of no reason why gunpowder, treason, should ever be forgot. But I'll also remember that confixed with riots is January 6th. Capitol stormed to prevent a government reformed. I know of no reason why shamans of treason should ever be mourned nor transformed. I admit that's a little bit more clunky than the original poem, but I've never been good at poetry. I'm a novelist. Kind of. Speaking of that, I did decide to release Ghostly Bodies on Amazon, so if you want a physical copy or a copy for your Kindle, you can buy it, linked down below. It'll still be available for free online, because I honestly feel pretty bad about charging for it, but having a physical copy is pretty cool. And in the future, if I do any edits to it, I'm only going to update the Amazon version, just because if I'm going to put effort into it, I want to make a little bit of a return, because unfortunately I'm kind of strapped for cash, and it's really affecting me. I also have another book that I'm releasing for free, and will probably publish when it's officially done. Smash Gal and Esvanir is a lot like a comic. It's very comic inspired. So why not read that? Also, like this video, or I'll send the Gestapo after you. And share it. Take over a TV station and broadcast it all over the world with a mini disc that I will forever associate with the Nintendo GameCube despite the fact that I never owned one myself. Why not comment another movie down below that I can review so that I have an ever-growing list of projects solely so that I can distract myself from all of the stress and thoughts that are desperately affecting me. Support me on Patreon if you want to. One of my patrons is La, the person who helped me out with my Gothica review and the retrospective I did after the fact. Another friend of mine is Danny, who suggested that I review the Snyder Cut, and you should be expecting that sometime in December. I don't know who the last person supporting me is, they didn't tell me and their name isn't listed, but I think that they're super cool as well. Until next time, this has been Sean, your not anarchist enough YouTuber. Signing off. She introduces it. I should stop doing the fucking accent. It's really hard once you get started to stop doing an accent, but my accents aren't even that good in the first place, so I suppose I should just stop and go back to my regular speaking voice. And E is the 5th level. You know, you have to get down to level V in order to really collect all of the good stuff. She then catches a news story about Prothero's dress. I'd watch Prothero in a dress. He's not like a remarkably good-looking man, but you know, with a little bit of makeup, he could pull it off, I think. She then catches a news story about Prothero's dress. Motherfucker, why dress? Why do I keep saying dress?